Welcome to the Evoke cast. I'm Coach Mark Postle here at Evoke Endurance, and joining me today for talking about all things Denali is my friend and fellow guide, Sam Hennessey. We're really excited to have Sam on the podcast today. For those that don't know Sam, he is a professional mountain guide and a high-level alpine climber who happens to have a wealth of experience, both guiding and personal climbing in the Alaska range, and also a fairly deep resume with ski descents in the Alaska range. So I think will be a really valuable voice in our Denali discussions for our athletes training for and thinking about going to Denali in the next couple of seasons. So if you would like more information on Sam, you can go to his guide service website, sunwolfadventures.com, and find contact info there if you'd like to engage him in that way. So welcome, Sam.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. It's fun to see you over the internet here.
Yeah, it's good to catch
It's
up a little bit. You've freshly back from Antarctica?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was at Mount Vinson for the last 3 weeks, roughly. I guess around a month, let's call it. Doing a couple rotations there, and yeah, back in the real world here for a few short months before I, head to Alaska. So
Yeah, and you have some guiding on the docket up in Alaska this season.
I do. Yeah, I'm actually not going to be on the West Buttress this year, which is my second year in a row, actually,
Oh,
after
yeah,
12. I had 12 on, and now I've got two off thus far. But yeah, I have a client for Mount Hunter. We're heading to the West Ridge, hopefully.
oh, yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, and then some personal projects on either side of that trip, probably. So I'll be up
yeah.
there for the usual 2 months.
Per the
Yeah.
usual. Yeah, if you had to guess how many trips into the Alaska range have you made between guiding and personal trips? I mean, I would, you've done, and what in my mind is over a decade of what seems like, 3 or 4 trips a year, depending on how you parse them out. Like it starts to add up after a bit.
Yeah, totally. I actually I was just thinking about that the other day, and I don't know the exact number, but it's been at least two per season for since 2012 with, I guess, there's a COVID interlude, and yeah, probably about 30, depending on how you want to count a trip. Some of the
Sure.
Alaska range these days, because of TAT and their awesome, reliable air travel, sometimes it's easier to go to the Alaska range than it is to go to Yosemite from Bishop. I
Yeah.
mean, no joke. Like
If you have to drive
you're
around, for sure.
you're in Talkeetna, you get in an airplane. 45 minutes later, you're on the glacier. An hour after leaving town, you can be, approaching your objective. So I've had several of those trips that have, barely lasted 24, 48 hours. You know, it's kind of nuts, the convenience of the place,
Yeah.
but at the same time, the incredible remoteness and harshness of the environment. It can't be overlooked for sure, but yeah, some of these you couldn't really call it an expedition. It's like, yeah, like I said, I've had trips to the local crag that have lasted longer
Yeah.
than some of
Well, I
these.
think especially when, you have a lot of experience in the range, you know exactly what you're getting into. You've done some climbing quite recently, you're acclimated and you can kind of pounce on it. Yeah,
For sure.
the
Yeah.
ski plane travel is kind of a ridiculous convenience just to plop you down in the middle of nowhere. And then the plane leaves and you're like, oh, all right, we're
Yeah.
we're doing the thing now.
Yeah. Hopefully I remembered my crampons.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Or your stoves, which I've forgotten.
Or
But
stove. Yeah. I think
that
we've
is
all
a,
probably
I do
had an
think that's a,
incident.
yeah, no, for sure. I do think that's a little bit of, it raises us an interesting point that, that is for people that haven't been in there, it's a little bit of a for real transition to town, from town to the mountain. That doesn't happen that same way on some other trips where you have a big approach factor. in that, the Alaska range is sort of a, it's a white, austere, remote place, once you're in there. And I've definitely had some clients that, they get incredibly wide-eyed for fairly good reason once that plane leaves, if they're
Oh
not
yeah.
used to that environment. And I think just being kind of mentally ready for that as best you can is helpful. And I also think that's where folks have done maybe some dedicated training trips in the range previously and kind of gotten over that hurdle. They aren't as put off by it because it's, you know, there is a historical precedent for people kind of, sort of freaking out and getting back on the plane. Like it's,
Oh, yeah, it's happened for sure. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I think that just being comfortable in the environment is a really underrated uh, attribute that people just waste tons of energy being worried, being like freaking out about stuff, not sleeping well. They
yeah.
get in a storm, the plane leaves, and all of a sudden it's dead quiet and there's nobody around and it's cold and all of a sudden you're thinking like, well, what did I get myself into? If you've done that before, it allows you to really kind of thrive in that environment versus just being maxed out and kind of everything being super crazy the entire time.
Yeah, I do think
Um,
that reduced stress and energy expenditure from comfort in the environment. And the thing I like to talk about, which is, easy to talk about, but hard for people to wrap their head around, is instead of thinking about like, oh, I'm going to be here for 16 days, we're doing this, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and this is how it's going to go. I just think about like, just pretend that you moved there. Like this is your, you bought a condo on the Hilton, no, you moved there. Like this is your new reality, and just get comfortable with it and make the most of it at every moment, and just kind of live sort of in real time and be like, okay, am I thriving right now? If not, why? What can I do to make it better right now? And not worry about like, 5 days from now and 10 days from now and all those things that just create that extra stress, because it's a harsh environment.
yeah, 100%, and that goes all the way back to just like your scheduling, right? Not having something that you absolutely must fly out for on a certain day, for example. Because then you just have that deadline hanging over your whole trip, and then the weather gets bad, even though you still have 5 or 6 days to go. It's like some stormy weather. You start thinking, oh, geez, well, maybe I should start flying out today because if I don't fly out today, then maybe it'll be bad for these days, and then maybe I won't, and you can
Yeah,
just kind of
totally.
spool yourself into this whole like what if scenario.
Yeah.
So yeah, just kind
Yeah.
of like you said, take the attitude of like, yeah, this is my reality now. I'm going to be in Alaska. This is a place where you can't really take anything for granted in terms of scheduling. So that's just how I'm going to live my life. I'm here on the glacier. If it gets stormy, I might not sleep for 2 days because I'm trying to keep my tent above the snow. And if it's really nice, I also might not sleep because it's time to take advantage of really nice weather and kind of make hay while the sun shines. And you're just really kind of just in the environment and adapted and doing whatever makes sense given what's happening.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think that's, maybe a nice segue. And I've got some bullet points here, but I do want to talk a little bit about sort of the mental, almost emotional side of climbing in there. And I think that the weather, in my mind, is one of the big factors that creates a lot of uncertainty in in the expeditions themselves, both with how long it's going to be, what you're doing on any given day, the pacing of it, the challenges of it, if it's reasonable enough to move but it's not perfect, if it's too hot, if it's too cold. And I find that snowballs a lot with folks where you can, I'm sure you've had them too, where you've right from the jump, the weather is kind of dictating a lot of things where you don't fly in. So the trip effectively hasn't started for some number of days. And I even, I had a trip on one occasion that never flew in. We actually never made it to the mountains, which is not really on people's bingo card when they sign up for a Denali. Obviously that's quite rare, but that's a possibility on one end. The book end of that is when you're done with the trip, there's no guarantee you're going to jump right on the plane and fly out. It's
Yeah.
usually works out, but I had unfortunately what was already one of my most lengthy trips at that point. Then we had a further 5-day no fly on the airstrip to get
Oh
out,
yeah.
and
Hmm.
people don't people don't like that mentally on trips. Like
No.
it's a real thing, and I think there's just some level of acceptance and flexibility that you need to come to grips with to have a successful trip and not stress about. And I think a lot of it's just around the weather. And it'd be interesting to get your take on it too. I think that the forecasting there has to be taken with like the biggest grain of salt of any mountain range I've worked in the entire world. And as much as I'm up there, I still don't totally understand why that is. But high pressure coming in doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be amazing from a temperature and kind of wind profile perspective, and it might not be suitable to move.
Uh,
And then I've certainly had, quote unquote storm cycles where, yeah, there's some precip and it's not perfect, but it's very serviceable for moving around, especially on the lower mountain. And I think that inaccuracy of forecasting also really grates at people because they see the forecast, it's inevitable, and they get their heart set on it. And when it doesn't come to fruition, that can just be kind of soul crushing. So have you had some experiences with that with people?
oh yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think, yeah, starting just, with the weather, yeah, for sure. Some of the most unpredictable weather of anywhere that I've been, in that it's often bad, but it's not predictably bad. And yeah, but the weather is your number one thing. And it's really just open up the tent in the morning, see what's going on, and do what makes sense for that day. So yeah, it's can be really frustrating for someone who, for example, trained really hard, had a really regimented program, wakes up at the same time every day, does this, at 8, does this at 9, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get to Denali and it's like, oh, we're on the lower mountain. It's hot. We're just going to wake up at, 2 in the morning every day for a couple days. But then as we get higher, it starts to get colder. And now we're doing something completely different. Now it snows for 3 days. So we basically do nothing, just lay in our tents. And then
Yeah.
the sun comes out, but the avalanche conditions are high. So we still do nothing, even though it's sunny. And that,
No, yeah.
it just kind of like, it's really, really hard to know what you're going to be doing day in and day out. And you just have to kind of embrace that as one of
Yeah.
the cool things about the range. And, yeah, the weather forecasting is often not very accurate. Yeah, I've really beat my head against the wall with that one over the years of trying to figure out some kind of pattern. And it does seem like it's gotten better, especially with multi-model forecasting and just like
Yeah.
being able to compare different weather models in order to get at least a degree of how confident should I be in any given weather forecast, and understanding the nuances of, oh, I used to only use, kind of the GFS, one particular weather model that's extremely pessimistic. So it basically would say it's going to snow every day,
Right.
regardless of whether it's perfectly sunny or, actually snowing. Um, and, when you start to bring other models into the mix, oftentimes you will see, oh, well, like, 50% of them are, 50% of them are saying it'll be sunny, 50% are saying it's going to be snowy. This is kind of a toss up, or, oh, they're 80, 90% in one direction or the other. Um, you just get into certain weather patterns and different flows that sometimes are just very unpredictable. And yeah, it might say it's going to be sunny and it might snow, maybe vice versa. Um, and yeah, that's just some of the reality of it. And you're fairly out of touch, out there. Although, that's starting to change for sure with the new technology. But you don't have access to those same forecasts. You're kind of
Yeah.
relying on your friends, or if you're working often, someone in the office is texting you that forecast, or sometimes there's a professional meteorologist that's providing forecasts to certain teams on the mountain, and those are getting kind of passed around word of mouth, and the rumor mill starts flying. And sometimes they're a little more accurate, but yeah, to be honest, like there are times when it's extremely difficult, even when you have a professional meteorologist looking at everything, only forecasting for the next 12 hours, they still can get it wrong up there. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think that, we probably operate in a little bit the same mental mode, at least from a guiding perspective up there, in that, you have a plan for the next day. There's the next step, and wherever the next thing to do is. I generally try and have a briefing with the clients every evening at dinner, and just expound upon that a little bit. Like, okay, here's the plan for
totally.
tomorrow, unless
Totally.
I change my mind,
Yeah.
and you unzip the tent at the appointed hour in the morning. If it's as you thought it was going to be, you do the next thing, and you don't worry
Right.
about the second, third, fourth step. And where this, we don't need to belabor this part too much, but I think it's useful for maybe some folks that are maybe going on a Denali trip that's unguided. I think one of the real tricks, or the kind of needle that's hard to thread, that has some consequences, is on the upper mountain. I feel like on the lower mountain, good enough weather is generally good enough. And if you get it a little bit wrong in your decision making, it's usually not catastrophic or not that big a deal. But I feel like the move to 14,000 foot camp in some ways, but certainly the move to 17 and then the ensuing summit scenario is a really good time to get it right if you're going to get it right. But it's also really hard because that's the time you would love the crystal ball and be like, okay, we have 4 days of pretty serviceable weather. We're going to do this whole last part of the trip and get down, and everybody's going to be happy. And what happens is, you need to move to 17. The forecast is decent. You stick your head out the tent. It's pretty good. So you pack up your stuff and you move to 17. And then you get pummeled for, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, fill in the blank number of days afterwards. And it's kind of an unpleasant place to get pummeled. But if you don't sort of seize the day and make it happen and move up there, you're never going to summit. So I've always found that
Yeah.
the trickiest part with the weather forecasting, because that's kind of the one time I really care, not just what today is, but also what tomorrow and the next day are. And if you get
Right.
into one of those models where the forecast isn't perfect, there's a downside to getting that really wrong. So yeah, I think you're probably a little more aggressive than I am about just like, if you get the singleton good day, screw it, we're moving to 17. You know,
Yeah. That was kind of how I got trained, as it were, to guide up there was, well, you can't summit from 14 with a
sure.
big crew of people. So, get up there, dig in. If you have a safe day to move, get up there and dig in, and, wait it out. And
Yeah.
that's certainly one philosophy. There are definitely others who go the other direction and just hang out down at 14 and wait for a more consistent weather window. I would say there's upsides and downsides to both. Certainly, it feels good to move up there and get, like you said, do the next thing. You're not really doing much down at 14. You're getting more
No.
acclimated potentially, but you might also be slowly losing your sanity. Uh, so,
Or not
you
so
get up to
slowly.
7. Yeah, or not so slowly, as the case may be. But, you get up there to 17, and if the weather's not good, then yeah, like you said, you're taking it, and it's hard work. You're building walls, you're um, trying to keep from blowing away. And one advantage that the guide services have is that we often have a lot of supplies relative to to an independent group. So
Yeah.
we can go up there with a bit of a safety net, knowing like, hey, if the weather's bad for a week, like we're not going to starve to death. We're not going to run
Yeah.
out of fuel. Where we can wait out almost anything. I mean, Sure, if it goes 100 miles an hour, we're going to be digging a snow cave just like anybody else would be. But, you know, in the meantime, we're going to have plenty of hot water, et cetera, et cetera. So, um, yeah, I would say that's a little bit the difference there from a guided perspective. Um, I definitely don't do that when I'm on a personal trip because I just uh, prefer to stay at 14 and
Right.
do some of the temps from there. But that's kind of a uh, different subject.
Yeah, totally. And I do think there's this sort of idea out there about not moving to 17 and climbing it from 14, which
Hmm.
is uh, extremely appropriate for certain individuals and even more wildly inappropriate for other individuals. And
Yeah.
and I actually get asked about that a fair amount in the coaching realm. And my patent answer for that, which you might have a bit of a take on, is uh when you get to 14 on the trip, if everything's going well, and most folks would be then making some acclimatization missions above there as part of that, before they actually try and go to the summit, whatever their program is. Most
Hmm.
people figure out really quickly if summiting from 14 is a thing that's sane for them. And my sort of metric for that is like, if you're at 14 and you're starting to get acclimated and you can make a run up to 17, and ideally maybe if you could even make a run up to like Denali Pass and back. And that just seems, I mean, it's going to be hard-ish, but that seems very like a fairly pedestrian half day activity. Then you're probably one of those people you're part of the discussion of something from 14, and if that really seems like you're digging pretty deep to round trip that in a day, you're pretty far from the summit when you're at Denali Pass on a day mission from 14. So that's always kind of one of my pieces of advice is just stick your toes in the water a little bit on those acclimatization runs from 14 and see how that pans out for you.
Yeah, I think absolutely that's a very responsible thing to do. It doesn't actually seem that many of the people that you see going for it really are doing that, as far as I can tell. So yeah, if that word could get out, but yeah, I mean the route isn't a secret, right? So
Right.
you're there, you're at 14. Um, Hopefully you can have the opportunity to acclimate. And if you haven't been on the upper mountain yet, then it's likely not appropriate for you to try to go to the summit. Um, I think people underestimate a few things, the altitude for sure, but I think the cold and that's effect on the amount of energy that you're using
Yeah.
is another one. Um, because, for most people going up roughly 6,000 vertical feet, coming back down in a day. People do that at home and they say, oh, I should be able to, and it's easy for them, right? And they
Yeah.
say, oh,
Yeah.
I can do that on Denali too for summit day. Like, look at what I'll have in my pack. It's not that heavy. Like, I can do it again. Uh, and then they get up there on Denali and it's wildly different. And it is for sure the altitude, but I think also just the cold, and you are wearing more stuff and using more energy for every
Yeah.
little
Every activity.
bit of ground that you cover. You do use significantly more energy than you would at home, unless you happen to live, I don't know, at 4,000 meters in the Andes or something. But like, it really, for most of us, if we live in the continental US, we just don't experience, even if you live somewhere like Montana that's super cold, you don't experience that combo of altitude and cold. And you also don't experience it after 2 weeks of kind of like getting the
Yeah.
beat down from the
Yep.
Alaskan weather.
Exactly.
You're
Yeah.
you're not starting from 100%. You're
Yeah.
probably not even starting from 80%. You're not well. Like, measure your resting
Yeah.
heart rate, right? So, anyways,
Yeah. I think I think that is a segue into a couple of things. And I've always felt like Denali sort of, whatever I was trying to do at any given time, it unpacked a little bigger than it should on paper.
Uh-huh.
And I have always thought about like why is that, and I think there isn't one reason, but I think you've touched on a couple of them there. I think that the altitude has a little bit harsher effect than that number would on paper if you're in Ecuador or in Mexico or something. I think that
Totally.
the the just the grind of whatever you did to get to that point in the trip, and like the 14 camp is a good talking point. Like, in other mountains, getting to that elevation is, you know, trivial sometimes, or
Yeah,
at
absolutely.
best it's not super, it's not as draining as it is there. And I think that, yeah, that day-to-day grind, even when folks are generally eating, sleeping, recovering sort of adequately, you're just not starting with a full deck of cards. So that really, that's hard on people. And I think, yeah, it bleeds into that discussion that you mentioned, where it's like, yeah, somebody that can do 5, 6, 7,000 feet in training at home is not necessarily going to translate to the way they think it is, in particularly in the Alaska range, kind of for those reasons. And yeah, it does suck it out of you. I also find that just in general, independent of success or failure on any given day or how hard it is, I do find that in general, and I'd like to get your take on this, when you have a climber that is reasonably well trained, and they're at least part of the discussion of somebody that should be able to summit, and they fail, which happens. uh when they fail, I generally see that it's not that any one thing was just so overwhelming they couldn't do it. It's that, they were a little behind the curve 3 days ago. They got a little too tired. They didn't completely recover. And they were sort of this degradation over a few day time period, or really the whole trip, maybe. And you just got to a point in the trip where they just couldn't recover, bounce back, and they just couldn't perform the workload on a given day. It's not that the thing that you were doing that one day was just so ridiculously hard, there was no way they were ever going to do it. They were just too beat down by the time you get there. And that's where I'm really on people a lot about, like, not thinking about perfections in the training, but thinking about a really high level of consistency in the training, and just being able
Mhm.
to, like, bounce back day after day and do what's asked of them, especially if the weather's good, like you were talking about earlier, and bring a high level of sort of almost what I think about is durability to the equation, as opposed to like sort of razor's edge fitness, if that makes sense. Have you seen that a little bit on
Y-
your trips?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's absolutely 100% what the type of fitness that's required to succeed on Denali on the West Buttress is. It's not this, like you said, it's not this razor's edge, super high end speed. It's not um, this like short duration, high intensity thing that then you can just be done with afterwards. This is a minimum 2 week expedition where you might be doing something strenuous every single day. And if you're not doing something strenuous, you're probably stuck in a storm, which is emotionally draining and just kind of like challenging in its own right. So basically you're embarking on this, multi-week low intensity uh kind of exercise, punctuated by some periods of that will be higher intensity and involve a little bit more like depletion of the body. So I think that really the thing to focus on in the training for sure is just consistency, like being able to not only do that, whatever that 1,500 meter heavy pack carry, whatever, but do that in a fatigued state and like
Yeah.
be ready and be mentally prepared for the fact that you are not likely going to wake up on Denali Summit Day feeling amazing, right?
Yeah.
Um, for a
100%.
million reasons. I don't think any of us are.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
all feeling pretty bad, but just like break it down, keep your world small on the mountain, right? Of like, all I got to do is this. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just focusing on this. But in your day-to-day reality on the mountain, it really is, it's that accumulation of like these small little cuts, these small little whatever, these little damages that get done. You get blisters. Oh, you forgot to put on sunscreen. Now you get super sunburned. You didn't drink enough water this day. It's like the accumulation of all these little errors and like things that get done to the body that add up over time and just like bring you down below the threshold of like being able to actually complete the task for that given day. Because like you said, like none of these days are actually that hard. Like moving to 17 is kind of the hardest one because you
It's
gotta
kind of
you
hard.
gotta you gotta backpack on. But like if you took that day in isolation, everybody would do it,
Yeah.
right? They'd be
Yeah.
like, oh, that wasn't that bad. But when you put it in the context of the greater expedition, especially if you've kind of been, blowing it
Right.
early on all the easier days, it's like, well, yeah, sure, it's easy. You can do this day and not drink that much water. You can do this day and not eat snacks when you should and not eat for recovery and, all this stuff. But when you take the cumulative effect of all of that and then you say, okay, now it's day 15, here's a 50-pound backpack, go up to high camp. Someone who absolutely could have done that on day one now can't because they've had this kind of just like slow degradation of their physical state and then also just lack of recovery because of the environment that they're in. They're it's light for 24 hours, so you might not be sleeping that well. It's quite cold, so you're
Mhm.
using a lot more energy than you thought. And then there's also, of course, the altitude, which it's moderate altitude in the grand scheme of things, but your body has so much more to worry about in Alaska than, sleeping in a hut in the Himalaya or something. At that equivalent 4,000-meter altitude, it's minus 20 in Alaska. Like, whereas
Right.
you're wearing running shoes in most other ranges in the world. So it's really like yeah, it's just a completely different deal. And your body doesn't acclimate as well in Alaska as it does elsewhere, just because you're uncomfortable for a lot of other reasons.
Yeah. And I also find that the other somewhat, cruel thing for folks that are a little underprepared on Denali, which is true on other mountains too, is it definitely escalates in technicality slightly as you get up the mountain, and for folks that
Sure.
they're sort of just climbing resume and background just doesn't really include enough of that sort of that basic movement skill perspective. Now they're
Hmm.
tired, they've used a lot of energy. Move to 17 days, a good example. Like you it's obviously you're not climbing water ice 5, but compared to just walking up the relatively flat glacier that a lot of the trip is encompassed before that, it can be intimidating for folks with a big pack. It's steeper, you've got some fixed line work. The 16 ridge, it feels airy for folks that don't have a lot of experience in that realm, and I think they also are wasting a good amount of energy just from their sort of basic movement skill and comfort in that exposed environment, at a time when that energy is like at an absolute premium of maybe the entire trip. um
Totally. Yeah. Yep.
so,
No, really,
yeah,
it
that
is. That
it's an
move
eye-opener.
day, that's the hardest day. Like, the pack's the heaviest. You got to go the same amount of vertical gain as you do on summit day. And it's more quote unquote technical, even though you wouldn't like think of it as technical climbing. If you don't have the footwork to cramp on your way up a 45-degree icy head wall for several hundred meters, you're going to get totally smoked on the
Yeah.
fixed lines. And then even though it's basically just walking on the on the ridge below 17 camp, yeah, like you said, the exposure. And if you're not confident on your feet, you're like looking down, like if I fall down there, I'm going to die. So that freaks you out. And it is just walking. So if you're adequately prepared and trained and et cetera, it's actually really cool. And like,
Yeah,
a lot of people say, and myself included, like I think that's the coolest part of the West Buttress. It's one of those things
absolutely.
where if your footwork is there and you can move confidently, you're like, oh, this is chill. this is actually quite enjoyable. And then someone who's not confident on their feet is like having this, they're 20 meters away from you, but they're having like this death defying experience and they're totally gripped. Um,
Right.
so anyways, yeah, I think that there is definitely a technical component to Denali that doesn't get talked about, I think. And it's just cramponing,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you don't, like you said, you don't have to climb steep water ice, although certainly being proficient climbing steep water ice will
Doesn't
make you feel
hurt.
yeah, it never hurts. But it's just, it's one of those like baseline mountaineering skills that honestly, like, it's one of the things that doesn't get emphasized. I see a lot of really good climbers, uh, it's good technical climbers even who,
Yeah.
they encounter that type of intermediate terrain where they need to use crampons and they just like watch, most whatever Yosemite rock climbers go to Patagonia, walk and try to cross a little snowfield or something. It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it looks extreme. And it's just one of those things. It's like this is the base of the pyramid, and a lot of
Yeah.
people these days certainly like get really proficient in other ways, and that sort of thing doesn't get neglected, or it does get neglected in terms of what people emphasize in their training. Um,
Yeah. And I think that's one of the areas where, it's the easiest to talk about, but the hardest to affect is, so many people live in a place that, it doesn't have a lot of terrain. Maybe it's not that wintry and they just don't have the opportunities kind of smacking them on the face to grow in that way. And, that's where I think that if you're not cognizant of that, it's easy to let that slip by the wayside and just just go for another trail run and think that your fitness is going to overcome all those things. But you get to the point where it doesn't, and
yeah.
that's where, especially with a lot of the athletes I work with one-on-one, I'm always trying to be on them about like, okay, let's set some intermediate goals here, whether they're, smaller trips to, like things that are going to involve that same skill set in a maybe a little more teachable environment, or just complete, skills oriented training trips, where somebody, goes to Pacific Northwest, or, they come out to Bozeman in the winter and like, they have to deal with the cold and, get them out in some terrain that is, at or above the level of technicality that they're going to experience, on the mountain, and just put the reps in, because it's something it's easily solvable. You just have to be in the environment that demands that activity, and yeah, just literally put the time in. And it
Oh,
just pays off in spades later.
oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, Denali it's kind of a big deal to climb, even by the normal route. And I've always thought like it's impossible to be over prepared. Like you'll never get
Yeah,
there
for
and be like,
sure.
oh, I wish I hadn't climbed all those
Yeah,
other mountains first.
right.
Right? Like it, the more you can do beforehand, the better you'll do up there, and the more fun it'll be in the end. Right? Um, and I think, it's never just one thing, but certainly the cramponing part of it is a big component. And yeah, often overlooked in favor of like, oh, I'm going to drag this tire around in the yard. It's like, yeah,
Right.
that's great, and the dedication does pay off, but you do need to like spend time in the environment as well. You can't just train,
Yeah.
like in the yard in Topeka, Kansas.
Right. Yeah. And that's where I think just about, everyone has limitations on their resources in their lives, right? Whether it's time, recovery capacity, maybe to a small amount, genetics, age, money for sure. But, when you have a big goal like this, if you know that a Denali is, you know, it's going to be a genuine challenge for you, it's towards the edge of the envelope of what is reasonably possible for you, then I think it's a real mistake not to dedicate a significant chunk of your resources towards being as prepared as possible. It's a
Mhm.
it's an expensive trip, it's a time consuming trip, it's a struggle for a lot of professionals to get effectively what might end up being close to a month off work, to, with travel to go up there and come home and everything. And when you're making that kind of
Absolutely.
commitment, you want to I don't think 2 or 3, 100% dedicated training trips in the winter and the spring leading up to it is unreasonable at all for people that don't have local access. And it's almost
No.
foolish not to, in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
because we just see those failure modes so much.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think that that is the number one reason why people why they show up at Denali unprepared is that they haven't spent enough time in the environment. And,
Yeah.
you're going to discover a few things in that environment. You're going to, not only are you going to improve your skills, but you're also going to likely come to the realization, uh, if this needs to be something that you figure out, you're going to figure out that you're not physically prepared for Denali
You're
somewhere
figure
else.
out the only thing you're gonna figure out is
Yeah.
that you're not ready if you're already on Denali.
Yeah. Yeah. You get to Denali, it's like, ooh, I shouldn't have come
Yeah.
here. Um, but if you figure that out somewhere else, you get your ass kicked on Mount Rainier. It's like, oh, you know, maybe
Yeah.
next year
Yeah.
is more
Totally.
realistic. And that's honestly like that's the biggest thing is people don't take enough time. Like unless you're coming from a very athletic lifelong background, like 6 months is not enough time to prepare for Denali. Like you
Yeah.
need likely a multi-year training program that involves uh multiple training cycles, multiple trips working on the more technical skills,
Yeah.
and uh, that's going to get you there. It's not going to be, I decided in October that this is what I want to do. It's if you're not coming from a very athletic background and you just need to like work on a couple sport specific things, if you're kind of coming from a less active background or like from ground zero in terms of mountaineering, you're going to need time. Like
Yeah.
Denali is a graduation climb. It's not like the one that you start with.
Yeah. And I always think about even from a guiding perspective, right? Um, we've both done a fair number of big guided group climbs up there, which, I don't want to speak for you, but I've always found fairly challenging, and I think you've done more than I have, where you've got like 8 or 9 clients. Um,
Uh-huh.
there's a lot of moving parts, right, to those trips when you're in charge of them. And and they're hard and you have to make good decisions, because it's kind of like I always think it's like trying to captain the Titanic. It's like you can do a lot of things, but you can't do much quickly. It's not a nimble environment,
Hmm.
and things matter. And I
Yeah.
just feel like when I'm in that guiding situation, I literally just don't have bandwidth to spend time with somebody to bring them up to speed in a place maybe that they're lacking. I just can't do it. Like I just have so many other things. And on another, like we guide together in the Tetons and, in other places, even I would argue like a Vinson, which is a super harsh environment.
Yeah.
I just have more bandwidth to absorb things, and up there I just don't. And, that's where I'm always
Yeah.
on my athletes. I'm like, this is not a learning environment. Like you want to go into it pretty much assured that you have every possible skill that you're going to need. And then if you're a little short here and there, of course, you can pick up on things, but it's not a place where you're like, oh, wow, I've never seen that. I don't really understand how that works. So like that's going to be a short trip for you. And it's not that, that it's not that nobody wants to make it good for you. It's just that I just find that from a guiding perspective, I've got my hands full with just the task at hand and a normal trip if everyone is competent.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's one of those things where, on the lower mountain where perhaps there's a little less going on, we have a little more wiggle room to, yeah,
Yeah.
to potentially work with someone. But the reality is that even on Denali, the or even like on Denali, the guides are working quite hard, even if everything is going totally smoothly. And so
Yeah.
as soon as you add to that by, let's say, having to train someone uh how to put their harness on every single day or whatever it is.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
that isn't it. Yeah, it's just not the environment to do that. And if that becomes, if there's a lot of that going on, then pretty quickly you're just not going to be able to deal with it anymore. And it's going to be, okay, either learn how to put your harness on or come back next year.
Or we'll be here next year.
Yeah, totally. And it's not like we don't want to, but
Yeah,
it's a tough life up there for everybody, you know.
yeah,
Um, Guides have a lot of extra weight. They've got a lot of decisions to make. They have 12, you know, if you're the lead guide of one of these larger Denali groups, you have 12 people that you're responsible for, including yourself. Um,
yep,
and there's a lot going on. You got to melt a ton of water every day. You got to get everybody fed. You got to make sure that,
yep,
you know, camp is buttoned down, nothing's blowing away. You got to make sure that if somebody's sick, that they can go down with the right ratio of guides to clients such that the you know people can get back
right.
up the mountain as well. There's a lot going on inside the head of the Denali guide, despite what it might look like on the
Right,
outside.
right. Yeah,
So
and as
yeah.
one of our co-guides in that era, and my friend Tom Torkelson used to say on Denali, he kind of envisioned going to 14 as like a dry run for everybody. And he's like, when I get to
Yeah.
14, he's like, I look around and I think, who would I like to have on my rope on summit day when it gets hard? And those are the people that really truly have some business going above there, because it does change nature a little bit, you know. And so, you know, you want to have your
Yeah.
act together as much as you can when the trip starts, but boy, whatever those little inadequacies might be, you want to have those ironed out by the time you get to 14, or it's not going to go well above there for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah, and that is a really nice thing about Denali, and it's something that I kind of tell everybody at the start of all the trips that I do is that, you know, it's Denali just gradually ramps up, and we have a lot of these, you know, these days lower on the mountain when it's okay to screw something up here or there. It's
Yeah.
okay to set your gloves down in the snow. Sometimes, you know, sometimes they
Uh-huh.
might blow away, but it's like, you know, you get a couple freebies lower on the mountain. Um, and it's a good opportunity to work out your systems. But certainly by the time you get to 14, like everything needs to be automatic for
Yeah.
sure. It's like when we roll into 14, everybody needs to be, you know, taking care of themselves, eating, drinking without a guide having to be looking over their shoulder saying, hey, did you have any water? Did you have any this? You know, don't
Right.
put your gloves on the snow. Uh,
Right.
like, this is how you set up your tent. Like, no, it needs to be happening because yeah, it's a harsh environment and it can be, uh, you know, you go up there and the weather's really nice and you think, why are these guys being such dicks about everything? And then you go up there and it is gnarly and it's like, oh yeah, this
Yeah.
is why.
Right.
Because when the yeah, when the weather's bad and you know when the shit hits the fan a little bit, like people, you're on a guided trip, sure, and we're gonna look out for you, but you need to take care of yourself a little bit too. Like it's important to have a little bit of
Yeah.
autonomy up there.
And I also feel like from a guiding perspective too, like uh, people can help themselves in that when you have a real, you know, when your group is pretty dialed and you're like, wow, this is a solid group, you know, like everybody really kind of has their act together. You're more warm and fuzzy, you know, as a lead guide in charge of all that. And when it's one of those days that's not perfect, but it's, you know, it's workable, you're like, yeah, we can do this. Like, you know, our
Right.
scene is tight. Like, I'm not nervous about this. But, you know, when there's a couple of outliers that, you know, that they're just on the ragged edge of watching out for themselves, even in the best of days, you know, you're going to, and rightfully so, you know, I think both of us would be like, yeah, we're sitting tight today. We're not, you know, it would be insane to go out there.
Right.
And
Right.
so that not only helps you, but it helps the other members of the group, you know, because you just have more latitude to
Hmm.
do things up there with a super tight group than you do with, you know, when there's a little more variation within the group, which is maybe more the
Absolutely.
norm, but you hope not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it gives you the confidence to, yeah, to hang it out there a little bit
Yeah,
more in terms of moving in more marginal weather or trying to
Yep.
squeeze a summit day into a tighter window or whatever,
Yep.
because you know that when the wind picks up and you're walking back and people are tired, like everyone's going to take care of themselves and no one's going to
Yep.
get frostbite and no one's going to just kind of keel over because they haven't eaten all day or whatever. It's like, no, everybody will be running a tight ship. If something comes up that's a little bit outside of the plan, like we'll just deal with it because it's no big deal. Whereas
Yep.
if simply existing up there seems to be a big deal, then it really reduces your options in terms of what you can do. Like basically, you just need perfect weather for everything,
Yeah.
and that doesn't make me feel good up there because, like we said, the weather forecast sucks. So
Right.
uh, you never, yeah, yeah. It's a rare time on Denali when I'm thinking, oh yeah, I have high confidence the weather's going to be really good for
Yeah.
multiple days.
Yeah. Yeah.
That just doesn't happen.
Basically never for me up there. I'm
Yeah,
always looking over my shoulder up there.
for sure.
Um, I
Yeah.
want to talk a little bit about a few specifics for kind of logistics because you've spent a lot of time in these environments, and
Hmm.
I know just from having worked with you, you're a super bright guy who spends a lot of energy thinking about equipment and just how to set yourself up for success logistically, both when you're working and maybe even
Hmm.
more so when you're on personal trips. I find Denali particularly challenging, maybe more than anywhere from just strictly a gear perspective. And this is to some degree whether you're being guided or not, in that it's a harsh remote environment. There's things you have to be
Hmm.
semi comfortable, to be successful. But if you started making a list of everything that it would be sort of nice to have in some circumstance, you'd have, I'm sure you've seen it as well, too, with unguided folks, you'd end up with, 100 kilos of
Oh yeah.
things that you can be assured that trip is not going to be successful just due to inertia. It's just Newtonian physics at some point.
Right. Yeah.
And so you need to find this middle ground, right? That's sort of workable. You're going to have all the things you need. You're probably going to leave a few niceties at home,
Hmm.
but that's the least of the evils. And I think that's just for people without a lot of experience up there, and even some with a bit of experience up there, that's just it's kind of a narrow needle to thread a little bit. And I think in general, a lot of people do themselves a disservice by just bringing either too much stuff or the heaviest version of each thing. And it's a death by a thousand
Right.
cuts. And I just have a lot of conversations with people around that. And so I've got
Hmm.
a super short list of areas where I see commonalities and where people just bring too much weight. And then maybe you can weigh in on that and a few other things that you've seen. So I find, and there's people that love to argue with me on this one. I find really heavy, sort of traditional 3-layer Gore-Tex shell tops and bottoms to be quite heavy and not maybe as useful as one might think on Denali. I find that people love to bring toiletries because they have a giant thing of toiletries at home. They think they can't live without for a couple, weeks on the mountain. And that sort of bleeds into the first aid scene as well there with drugs and, things that maybe there's some overlap in the group, especially a guided group. And especially in our modern age, and this is a tricky one, just with, battery packs and solar panels and electronics, because those are quite heavy, albeit if you're stuck in a storm for a long time, also can be somewhat useful because you have some entertainment. So those are areas where I see people tend to go overboard in ways that maybe they can trim some. But besides the fact that they bring the heaviest possible ice axe ever made, and all those things. So what are some
Yeah.
do you have some advice or tidbits or things you've seen over a group of people that you're like, yeah, this is common, let's eliminate this?
Um, yeah, I mean, really, you could kind of go across the board, to be honest, with all of it. I would start with
Yeah.
people's backpacks. For example, the Gregory Denali Pro backpack that people tend
Uh-huh.
to bring on Denali weighs, I believe, like 10 or 11 pounds empty.
Yeah.
Horrible backpack. One of the worst packs ever made. And yeah, so just starting off, right? You're about 5 pounds or more heavier than, for example, like the Black Diamond Mission 75 backpack, which is about, uh, if you can't fit all your stuff into there, you probably brought too much.
Yeah.
Um, Ice axes for sure. Yeah, people are
Yep.
bringing, uh, yeah,
Battle axes.
like you said, some of the heaviest axes ever made for an ice axe for a mountain where realistically you don't actually ever need to use your ice axe.
Right.
So um, you're using a ski pole for most of the time, and if you're on a guided trip, your guide will probably have you have your ice axe out at times. But also there's about 98% of the mountain where you couldn't fall if you tried. So
Right.
um, you don't you don't need that thing. Like bring a light one.
Yeah.
Do yourself a favor,
Yeah.
and then crampons as well. I would say, you don't need the super overbuilt heavy uh crampons with a million points underneath. You're gonna be steel crampons, I think, are a good idea, but
Yeah.
I don't think that you need to have the absolute heaviest pair. Um, the lighter, really, the better. Um, because every time you lift your foot up, you have to lift up your crampon. Um,
And you're not putting them on until you get to 11. They're just in your bag, that's
totally. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And even above 11, there are potentially times when you're not even, when you're snowshoeing or whatever, if the snow's super deep. So, um, yeah, starting there, I think hard shells, you're right on the money there also. It does occasionally rain on Denali, including sometimes all the way to 11. I believe you and
Um,
I were nearby to each other one time when uh, we, yeah, anyways, it happens. It happens up there. However, overall, the ambient humidity is like really quite low. And even if it's raining, a lightweight version of those Gore-Tex pants
sure.
and of the Gore-Tex jacket is going to work. It's going to work
Yeah.
just fine for that environment. You're not, going ski touring in Whistler or something,
Yeah.
right? Like you're not just in this really moist environment. So even if you get a little bit wet, you will dry out quickly. And having a hard shell that's lightweight uh, is really going to reduce the bulk and heft of your backpack. Um, I find that those jackets and pants really have the most utility in blocking the wind. So
Yeah.
full side zips on the pants, but lightweight material is great.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was drugs and toiletries. Yeah, I mean, bring whatever personal stuff you got. Denali's not the time to try and quit your addictions, whatever they may be. But like, uh, yeah, bring enough. Don't go totally crazy on the like personal hygiene stuff. Like a pack of wet wipes is great, but then beyond that, you don't
Right.
need all this other stuff.
And you
Um,
don't need the 150 pack or whatever those are. That's like a giant, because
totally.
and
Yeah,
those turn into a frozen brick that it's functionally impossible to use anyway.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, totally. And then the electronics, yeah, I think it's a good idea. Plot it out ahead of time with whoever you're climbing with.
Yeah.
You only need like one battery pack, one solar panel per tent. Kind of, yeah, really pare that stuff down because it is nice to have, and certainly I'm not going to tell people not to bring it, but like, for example, like with a guide team or when I'm up there with a friend, we'll talk about it ahead of time and we'll come up with a plan for whatever our entertainment system is.
Right.
And that's what we'll bring, and we won't duplicate too much stuff. And
Right.
especially if you're on a guided group, it's not just you and your tent mate, right? There's a bunch of folks. They've all probably got solar panels. They've all got batteries. If yours
Yeah.
blows up or the wire breaks or whatever, like you can borrow somebody else's. So um, it's not that everyone needs to have their own. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You'll live too. If you don't have electronics for one
Right.
day, you'll live. I've actually done it.
I know. Yeah. I was going to say one time I did a Denali with no music, no book, no nothing. I just stared at the wall. and I
Yeah, I've
lived.
done a few of those.
Yeah, I lived. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think is maybe a little bit of a misnomer there is, or with just environmental challenges and being prepared for them on Denali is like it can be pretty hot on Denali. And that's if you kind of
Hmm.
know what you're doing and move at appropriate times. And we've both seen people making quite interesting decisions about when to move with regarding to the hot cold cycles. I think that people always think about that, they think they're going to starve to death. They think they're going to freeze to death, which, you want to
Yeah.
be aware that those, you need to eat and be warm. But it can be brutally hot on the lower part of the mountain and, with the
Oh yeah.
reflectivity and everything. So I think that, being ready for that from just a perspective of covering up, with probably a sun hoodie, a buff, like those kind of things, and just being ready for that environmental challenge is sometimes people just don't think that's going to be the case. And it is ridiculous up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Or just like thinking, I just encountered this on Vincent where it's like, people think, oh, I'm on a cold mountain, I need to wear like a down suit
Down. Yeah.
all 24
Yeah.
hours a day.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, Denali can be one of the hottest feeling places on the planet for sure.
In the
It
world.
like,
Yeah.
which you really, yeah, you wouldn't expect, but it is. So yeah, having when you know, when you're thinking about when should I be traveling, don't just say I leave at 6 a.m. every day or I leave at 10 a.m.
Hmm.
every day, or whatever it is. You need to base that off of where you are on the mountain and what the weather's doing for sure. Um, and then if you're going to be traveling in the sun below, especially below 11, but honestly
Yeah.
below 14 for the most part, you need to, yeah, don't wear long underwear.
Yep.
Like have a thin pair of gloves, have a sun hoodie, be ready to just be wearing a base layer or maybe just a base layer and a wind shirt or something. Like you really can give yourself, borderline heat stroke in a pretty short amount of time. It's
100%.
it's really really hot. And honestly, sometimes if you like sleep in or whatever and it's a million degrees, it's probably just better just to chill and
Just
wait
don't
until it
go.
cools off.
Yeah.
Just don't go. That's
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might end up, and I'm sure you've seen it too, where, and especially coming down, I think is where the errors get made. But some people do it going up, where maybe you're at 14, the trip is you're wrapping up, and you're going all the way to the airstrip, and you're trying to make some educated decisions based on a few parameters around that. But one of them, especially with mid to late season trips, you want to cross the glacier, in the wee hours, when it's firm, crevasse fall, hazards minimized, and you're not baking like a potato in foil down there. And someone will leave, 8 hours before you from 14. And then somewhere along the line, you cross paths with them. And they have just, they've gotten it so wrong. They've just eddied out
Uh-oh.
somewhere on the glacier, or, you cross paths with them in base camp, and it's, they're just in the worst possible way. Just like, so
Yeah,
yeah, you have to be smart there for sure. It's leaving earlier is not necessarily result in an earlier arrival at your destination.
totally. Yeah, it seemed, I don't know, I've noticed over the years there was kind of this trend of people kind of being like, yeah, we're going to do the death march. And it was always
Yeah.
like, I will walk from 17 to the airstrip without stopping.
Yeah.
And for some reason, just because people want to get the heck out of there, I guess. But like,
Right.
it seems like these days people have kind of stopped doing that because everyone realized that, like you're saying, in roughly the same amount of time, you can descend to 14 or 11 and then sleep for 8 hours, wake
Right.
up again, walk the rest of the way. And usually, yeah, like you're arriving at the airstrip at the same time as the people who've kind of been staggering slowly down the mountain that entire time without sleeping. So, anyways, uh, yeah, yeah,
Make good
just,
choices.
yeah, use your brain. Um,
Well, in the
and
time that
honestly,
we have left, I want to touch on a couple of things that maybe are slightly more pertinent for the climate that's going on an unguided, we'll say West Buttress trip or something of that ilk.
sure.
Because I think that that's, you know, something that we've done a bit of, maybe to get acclimatized for things, but, you can't help it when you're guiding just to see between us, we've probably seen thousands of unguided independent climbers up there. And there's definitely some commonalities in the way that those trips come unraveled. And they come unraveled quite a bit in my experience for what I think of as probably largely solvable issues, or if you had gotten out in front of it in the run up to trips. So I've got a few notes here, but you can weigh in on these. I think maybe the biggest one is just the dynamic of the group. And a lot of this, I see where this goes wrong, is it's a group that just doesn't have a lot or maybe any real mountain experience together, and in any kind of remotely consequential environment where they have to group decision make, et cetera. And this is where on a guided trip, the guided trip is not a democracy by any means. Everybody gets their voice, their opinion, but there's only one vote, and that's that's either yours or mine on our trips as to what's going to happen. But if you get four dudes who met on mountain project going up there, who haven't really battle tested their wherewithal together, I think that's the number one place where those trips kind of come apart. And you could have gotten out in front of that by doing some kind of meaty training trips together. Do you you've done a lot of personal climbing with different partners. Like, what's your take on that on Denali?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. The more experience you have with your partners, the better. And just kind of as a general philosophy, for me anyways, it's who I'm climbing with is more important than what I'm climbing. So if I didn't have like a good friend to go to Denali with, I probably just wouldn't go on an expedition of that kind. The objective being a lot less important than just the overall experience of doing it with your buddies. Selfishly, I would love for the mountain project West Buttress teams to continue to go up there, because it's quite entertaining usually.
Could be more entertaining.
Well, yeah, for sure. Like, just a bunch of we can sit around here and talk about how like predictable it is, right? A bunch of random people go up there, and it often explodes with entertaining results. But hey, they're giving her a go, so it is cool. I admire the spirit, but I also would recommend for sure that especially if you're going up there with like-minded internet chat room enthusiasts, that you meet up somewhere else first, to just make sure that everybody's at the right level of sanity and cleanliness, and all the things that kind of
risk averseness or lack thereof.
Yeah, exactly. Like, those things, they might not seem like they matter when you're emailing with somebody, or even if you meet up over a beer, but by week 2, when your partner's clipping their toenails in the kitchen or whatever it is, and it like starts to tensions can run high.
And kind of in the nitty gritty of where things also go wrong outside of the group dynamics and decision making, which I think is just epic up there. One of the places that I wouldn't have thought of that I have seen a lot of, or and what we're talking about here, a lot of times you don't actually see it, you hear it, because we're behind a piece of nylon doing our thing, and there's somebody camped next to you doing their thing behind a piece of nylon. So you hear a lot of the things that are coming unraveled more than physically see it. But folks they're just not accustomed to the environment as far as the kitchen. And that's melting snow effectively and efficiently. It's cooking food efficiently that's nutritious without burning it in a timely matter that doesn't go on for 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours at night, and et cetera. and just food planning in general from the get-go seems to be just kind of epic for people. But
Mhm.
over a 2 or 3 week trip can just really make or break the trip.
Mhm.
Have you seen that as a kind of a commonality with unguided folks, just kind of just a lack of experience in the kitchen in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, no, I never really thought about it, but yeah, now that you mention it, epic multi-hour kitchen sessions
Oh,
do seem to be a common theme up there. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I think that one thing that the guided groups have figured out is that they bring way more stoves than your
uh-huh.
average independent group of a similar size. So,
Yep.
I'm talking like if I have a group of 4 people, I'll have
Yep.
3 whisper lights and potentially also like a, you
Reactor
know,
or something.
reactor or something.
Yep.
Um, you the more stoves really, the better. Like, and you're
Yep.
stacking those whisper. You're not like that's not like for 3 separate saucepans. That's like
Right.
right, 3 of them under a thing. That's
You're
how you
making a
melt water
furnace out of all
quickly
three of
overnight.
them.
Totally. Yep. And that I mean, even if I'm up there with just one friend, I'll definitely have 2 stoves.
Yeah.
Party
Yeah.
of two, 2 stoves for sure. Potentially even 3, depending on the style of trip that we're going for. But like,
Yep.
not only now do you have a backup in case one of your whisper light stoves, craps the bed, which doesn't really happen. Like if you know how to, that would be one random aside, but like folks should learn how to fix all of
Learn how to
their
service a whisper light.
cooking. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really quite easy actually,
Yep.
even for those who aren't mechanically inclined. But like, they're almost always fixable, even when they seem like they shouldn't be. But the number of times that people have taken their stoves over to our tent, and you
Oh
have
God.
to like,
Yeah.
it takes like 15 seconds. And you're like, here you go. Anyways, yeah. So that would be uh, one piece of advice would just be to bring more stoves than you think. You don't need to bring more fuel necessarily, like your fuel consumption's about the same, but like instead of running that one stove for an hour trying to melt 4 liters of water or an hour and a half or whatever, if you have 2 stoves, it'll probably take 20 minutes,
Yeah.
right? It exponentially decreases
Yeah.
the amount of time that you need to melt a given amount of water, and yeah, it just gives you more time to do whatever other stuff you want to do, sleep probably.
Right.
um
Or at least not breathe carbon monoxide.
right, which is
Anything
quite
but
nice. Yeah.
that.
And yeah, I'm a huge fan of like kind of the hybrid white gas canister approach up there.
Uh-huh.
So like having a canister stove for the morning, where you've already melted the all your water the night before, right? It's morning, you want to get on the move, whatever. Not only can you make a hot drink while you're still in your sleeping bag, but you can also you're just like
Yeah.
making hot water much faster with a reactor than you are with your whisper lights, which you have to wake up, you have to get out, you have to prime them, make the big fireball,
Yeah.
then get
Totally.
them going. Sure, if you have a group of 12 and that's kind of the only option. But really, I think, especially for smaller groups, but even for the bigger groups too, like you can boil a tremendous amount of water quickly with those things, especially if it's
Yeah.
already melted.
Yeah.
Um, but when it comes to just sheer like horsepower for
Yeah.
just melting a bunch of snow, I there's nothing better than a couple whisper lights. Yeah.
Yeah.
2, or yeah, like I said, even 3 stacked underneath a pot is
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, for folks that didn't pay attention in physics class, where you talk about how much energy it goes to change the state of a solid to a liquid, you
Right. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
really understand that once you've done a Denali. You're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, this takes some horsepower
Yeah.
to change the
It
state there.
does. It
Um,
does.
the other thing I see with unguided groups a lot is making interesting, or what in my mind is fairly interesting decisions. Just about like when to move, how far to move, where to camp, those kind of things. And, there's certainly sometimes good reasons, and you can do things more nimbly with a small group. I never believe that everybody has to do the exact same thing in the mountains, because, we're all an experiment of one. But the West Buttress is a fairly heavily traveled mountaineering route, obviously mid-season.
Hmm.
And there are pretty logical guardrails to what to do when within a range of sort of what I think of as sanity. And I'm forever seeing someone doing by themselves or their group alone doing whatever the complete polar opposite thing is at that moment of it, in what to my
Sure.
mind is logical and what everyone else is doing. And so I always think about, like, if you're the only one that thinks it's a good idea to do this thing on this given day, that, not with 100% certainty, but it might be a good chance to just be a little bit self-reflective and be like, well, how is it in our group we decided that it was a really good idea to move to 17 today? you know and you know even the Sam Hennessey, who's done this 25 times with a giant group, is like, no, that's ridiculous, and no one else is going except maybe some Russians or something that are up there. um what would your advice be for people that are just trying to make those decisions about the agenda and moving and just trying to do what is going to make sense and set them up for success?
Well, I think, it's kind of a big question, right, of
Yeah.
decision making in the mountains, right? And
That's exciting. It is
um,
for sure.
it's always hard to know if you're making the right decision, but certainly when you're around a lot of people, just because everyone is doing something doesn't mean that it's a good idea for sure. I
Yep.
can think of one example in particular where all of us, based on a forecast, decided to try to move to 17. We all just got completely blasted by winds on the ridge, had to come down. And then everyone who said, yeah, that seems like a dumb idea, and stayed in camp, they all went up the next day and had a
Because they
beautiful
were
summit
fresh.
day
Yeah.
because they were fresh, whereas we were all just too tired.
Yep.
um, so sure, you can always, just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean that it is the thing to do. But um, oftentimes, when, if certainly, like you said, if you find yourself the only one who thinks it's reasonable to do something, you should probably have a pretty good reason for it. And anytime you make a decision, I don't think that you should ever view that decision as final. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's something that, I think it goes well beyond just moving camp on the West Butchers, but just anytime you make a decision to do something, you should always be second guessing yourself and asking yourself, okay, what did I miss? Why am I wrong? Why shouldn't I be doing this? And if you
Yeah.
talk yourself
Yeah.
out of it, then you should always have the humility to say, you know what, actually, this is a bad idea. I'm going to set my tent back up and
Yeah.
cook breakfast or whatever, because it just, I think a lot of the time people kind of, they make the decision like, okay, we're going. And then they just kind of are like locked into this, like, we're going. And the reality is that even no one is moving fast up there. Like, we're not F1 drivers. We're walking at, even when people are talking about people who climb Denali fast, none of them are actually going very fast. If you
Right.
like saw them moving, you'd be like, oh, that guy's walking down the street or whatever. Like, it's not, no one is really running up there. Even people who are setting speed records, the rate that they're moving at is quite slow. You have plenty of time to make decisions. This is all unfolding over the course of hours or days, right? And
Right.
so when people get locked into this, like, I've just seen it a million times where people, yeah, they break down camp. The weather might be fine. They leave camp. The weather's a little less fine. They're moving at a very slow rate. So by the time they're 4 hours out of camp, they're at the base of the fixed ropes or whatever. And now it's just insanely windy up there. But instead of turning around, they just keep going. Right. And um, you're never committed to your decision on Denali. Like, you really aren't. You're not committed at all, ever. Just turn around
Yeah.
and go back down
Yeah.
the way you came.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
likely that will solve the problem and avert the catastrophe that often unfolds when people just kind of continue this slow march uphill into the wind. It, like, that's the thing that that gets people and it freezes them, and and it occasionally leads to really bad outcomes, as in people die, but it often leads to what I would still call quite bad outcomes, where people get really bad cold injury.
Yeah.
And um, I think that there's been a lot of that. Um, I don't know if the instance of it is actually increasing or not, but it certainly seems like there's plenty of instances of it, even though theoretically we're supposed to be getting better at doing all this. You just see a lot of people, and they just go up and they just keep going
Yeah.
until
Yeah. Yeah.
they just physically can't. And then they try and set up some sort of little camp, and they sit up there in the wind for a few days, and then they stagger back down whenever the wind drops with black fingers and
Right.
noses and stuff. It's just not. Uh, it's just also unnecessary.
Yeah.
Why not just come down? Like, it's horrible up there. Just come
Right.
down. But I think people they say once they make that decision, they're doing it. And
Yeah. The
like,
die is cast.
the die is cast as soon as they stuck their head out the tent in the morning.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I mean, everyone's obviously free to do what they want, but I think in a responsible way to approach all mountain decision making is always to be trying to second guess yourself, and always be like looking for that reason that you're doing the wrong thing. Um,
Yeah.
and that's certainly how I find guiding on Denali to be super stressful when it comes to moving above 14, because it's a pretty big deal to go up there, and I'm just like constantly wondering if I'm blowing it basically the entire
Yeah.
time that I'm
Yeah.
above 14 camp. Um, yeah.
Well, I think that's a really good, way of thinking about the fact that the nature of the whole experience is dynamic, you know, and that at any given moment we make a decision in a static environment. You're looking up, and at that it's like video versus taking still pictures. You look up and you're like, yeah, this is good. This is
Mhm.
the thing to do right now. But what you're really trying to predict is what's it going to be like 4 hours from now, 8 hours from now, and you don't actually know, because it's a dynamic environment. And so anytime you're in a dynamic environment, your decision making needs to equal that. It needs to be equally dynamic
Mhm.
as the environment, or ultimately those decisions that you probably, even if you made a very good decision earlier, is gonna lead to a suboptimal outcome.
Yeah,
And I think there's days on Denali where that environment is incredibly dynamic. Um,
totally.
and if you don't kind of match that energy with your decision making, you're going to suffer the consequences on occasion. So I think
Yeah.
that's incredibly sage
That's
advice, and a good kind of global way of thinking about, not only climbing in Alaska, but just climbing in general and in terrain that has consequence.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's the smart way to do it. Like, you make the decision with there's no shame in turning around when you get more information, or you
Yeah,
think about the information that you have a little differently, whatever it is. Um, but yeah, failing to adjust to changing conditions is just it's just kind of crazy. Like, it's not the mark of like a true mountaineer or something. It's the mark of a crazy person just
right,
marching up to their doom.
right,
Which,
right. Totally.
I mean, it's crazy. You sit there in 14 and you just sort of watch this unfold, and you're like, oh boy, here goes another. Here we go
Right.
again.
We'll see how this one goes.
Uh, yeah, totally.
Which you
Uh,
do have a ringside seat there at 14 for the whole upper mountain. So,
yeah,
well, I really deeply appreciate you taking time to sit down with us, Sam, and talk about Denali in particular, and maybe hopefully a couple of nuggets for the greater mountaineering community there. Do you have any last thoughts about Denali? You've spent a lot of time up there. I know it's a special place in your heart.
yeah. No, I, I think it's just an otherworldly environment up there. Being high up on Denali, there's nothing really like it in the world. Yeah, just that environment in Alaska is something special, with the high peaks all the way down to the tundra. spending time up there it's a huge privilege. It's really cool. And I don't think anybody who goes there uh ever really regrets it. It's it's just yeah, it's super special. And that's not just because I've, you know, spent years of my life up there. It's
Spent 18 cumulative months of your life up there.
yeah, yeah, at least for sure. No, yeah, I'm not just trying to justify that. That's just like uh I feel really lucky that I've gotten to do that. It's really cool there. So yeah, if you're thinking about going, you should go. It's cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time, and thanks to the greater audience
No.
for tuning in, and I hope that everybody enjoyed our discussion. For those that would like to get a hold of Sam or follow up on his guiding, you can go to sunwolfadventures.com or email him at sunwolfguiding@gmail.com. And you can follow us at Evoke Endurance on Instagram. Be sure to check out all the free resources we have on our website at evokeendurance.com. The forum is a great place to ask questions there and hopefully find answers. Have a good one.